The 1990s, an era of wild business wars, collapsing empires, and sudden fortunes. But beneath the booming headlines lurked something far darker, a string of mysterious contract killings that shocked entire nations. Famous bankers, journalists, politicians, one by one, they were silenced. Who ordered these hits? What secret motives drove them? And why, decades later, do we still not know the full story? Tonight, we dig deep into the cases where the official files don't match the whispers in back alleys. Prepare to follow a trail of hidden money, secret services, and deadly rivalries, because some truths were never meant to see the light. The violent dawn of the 90s. It begins with a sense of whiplash. One day, the streets felt almost ordinary. The next, everything seemed up for grabs. Cafes that once closed politely at dusk now buzzed with late-night deals. Flashy cars with tinted windows appeared where there had been quiet sidewalks, and everywhere you turned, someone whispered about fortunes being made overnight. But beneath the bright neon and the sound of quick money, there was something sharper. People sensed that the old rules were gone, yet no new rules had arrived. Police budgets shrank. Courts moved slowly. Politicians argued over new laws, while street gangs and fresh-minted business tycoons simply acted. The vacuum left by a fading superpower became the perfect stage for risk-takers and for killers who thrived when nobody was looking too closely. In the early 1990s, entire economies shifted almost in a single season. State industries that had taken decades to build were sold off in months. Mines, oil fields, shipping routes, even newspapers, anything could be bought if you had the right cash and the right friends. This frantic wave of privatization created dazzling opportunities. A factory manager could wake up a millionaire. A young trader with the right phone number could corner an export deal and buy a fleet of luxury cars. Yet the same gold rush pulled in tougher players. Former black market groups, ex-soldiers, and men from old security agencies suddenly found new jobs as private protection. In truth, many acted like mini-armies for hire. Their loyalty followed the biggest payment, not any badge. When a dispute arose over who owned a warehouse or an oil terminal, court papers were less persuasive than a silent visitor with a cold stare. Ordinary citizens felt the shift almost overnight. Shopkeepers hired guards. Apartment blocks formed night watches. Parents warned children not to answer the door after dark. News bulletins told of bold daytime robberies. Business leaders gunned down on crowded avenues, and witnesses who somehow could not be found. Each story fed the sense that invisible hands were rearranging society while everyone else simply tried to stay out of the way. Governments across the former Soviet space and beyond scrambled to react. New laws on private security and organized crime were drafted, but enforcement lagged behind reality. Even where democratic reforms took hold, prosecutors were overwhelmed. Files piled up, suspects slipped across borders, and rumors of official involvement blurred every case. For ambitious entrepreneurs, paying for protection was not just an option, it was survival. Meanwhile, the media landscape exploded. Bold newspapers and television shows raced to expose corruption. But investigative reporters also became targets. They dug into bank schemes and shady imports, and soon learned that a single phone call could end a career or a life. The line between business rivalry, political intrigue, and pure gangster violence grew impossible to trace. This was the violent dawn of the 90s, a period when fortunes and fates could change in a single phone call, and when settling a dispute in court seemed almost quaint. Power was shifting fast, but it was still unclear who would hold it in the long run. And that uncertainty set the stage for the first shocking murders that would define the decade's dark reputation. One of the earliest and most chilling involved a flamboyant banker whose rise had been as sudden as the new money itself, a figure whose story we explore next. In The Banker Who Knew Too Much. The banker who knew too much, he loved attention. Expensive suits, a chauffeur-driven car, a corner office with glass walls that caught the sun. In the early 1990s, this banker seemed to embody the new age of instant fortunes. Newspapers followed his every move, calling him a wizard of finance. But in a world where money and politics collided daily, fame was a dangerous friend. Behind the glossy magazine covers, his bank moved sums so huge they barely fit into official ledgers. Deposits arrived from oil exporters, shadowy intermediaries, and freshly minted businessmen whose names no one could quite spell. Some said he was simply brilliant at attracting capital. Others whispered that his bank was a giant washing machine for illicit cash. Every new rumor added to the legend and the risk. One winter evening, after a routine meeting, he stepped into his armored sedan. A short drive later, the city lights flashed red and blue. Gunfire had shattered the night. The driver was killed instantly. The banker slumped forward, mortally wounded. The attack lasted seconds. The killers vanished into traffic before anyone could react. For many, it was the moment when the upbeat mood of easy money gave way to the cold reality of the 90s. The official story came quickly. A well-planned robbery. Investigators said criminals targeted him for the large sums that often traveled with top executives. Yet the logic never felt complete. No cash was taken, no jewelry stripped. His briefcase, packed with papers, remained untouched. In backrooms and smoky cafes, people traded their own theories. Some said he was about to expose vast offshore schemes connecting big energy companies and political insiders. Others believed he had borrowed heavily from international partners and could no longer repay. A few hinted at even deeper motives, that he was preparing to enter politics, carrying documents that would shake entire ministries. Each version deepened the mystery. The investigation limped forward. Detectives announced leads, then quietly closed them. Witnesses contradicted each other. Key CCTV footage went missing, accidentally overwritten. A junior investigator who publicly questioned the robbery theory was soon reassigned to another city. Within months, the case file thickened without a single confirmed suspect, yet fragments of his final days later surfaced. A close aide recalled that the banker seemed tense, checking his phone constantly. He cancelled meetings without explanation. Another colleague claimed he spoke of dangerous secrets and a plan to leave the country. These testimonies hinted that he sensed a trap closing around him. Meanwhile, his bank did not collapse. It was swiftly absorbed by rivals. Contracts worth millions changed hands almost overnight. Some of the very people he had planned to meet in the coming weeks turned out to be unexpected beneficiaries of his sudden death. To many, the speed of those deals looked less like coincidence and more like careful preparation. The banker's funeral drew a mix of mourners, politicians in dark coats, foreign investors, and a surprising number of bodyguards scanning the crowd. Speeches praised his vision, but the unspoken question lingered in the frosty air. Who wanted him silent, and why? This murder sent a chilling message through boardrooms and trading floors. If someone so visible and well-protected could be struck down without consequence, who was safe? Bankers hired more guards. Lawyers bought bulletproof cars. A new code of caution spread through the business elite. Yet the pattern was only beginning. The next targets were not bankers, but voices of truth, those who tried to connect the dots in print and on camera. As the 90s rolled on, fearless reporters would become the next focus of deadly attention. Their stories lead us directly into the next chapter: media under fire. Media under fire. The presses rolled late into the night, spitting out fresh front pages. Headlines shouted about new billion-dollar fortunes and dizzy privatizations. But tucked inside, many newspapers were sharp investigations that cut much deeper. Brave reporters mapped the tangled links between rising business empires, old security structures, and sudden bursts of violence. Readers devoured these stories. Politicians winced, and somewhere in the shadows, someone started to draw a different map of journalists who had to be stopped. One of the decade's most striking murders began like an ordinary evening. A well-known editor locked up his downtown newsroom, exchanged jokes with colleagues, and headed to his car. Minutes later, a quiet side street flashed with muzzle fire. Neighbors heard only a brief stutter of sound. By the time help arrived, the attacker was gone, leaving behind a stunned city and a trail of unanswered questions. Police moved quickly at first, roadblocks went up, sketch artists worked through the night, yet the case soon slowed. Witnesses remembered little. Security cameras were mysteriously dark. Theories multiplied. Was it a robbery gone wrong? An argument turned fatal? Or was it something more methodical punishment for words printed that very week? Colleagues of the slain editor filled the airwaves with possibilities. He had been investigating privatization scandals, shady energy contracts, and connections between organized crime and municipal officials. Just days earlier, he had confided to a friend that powerful people were pressuring him to kill a particular story. No one could prove who those people were. And he was not alone. Across the region, reporters covering high-stakes business and political corruption began receiving late-night calls and anonymous threats. Some found tracking devices on their cars. Others noticed strangers at their apartment doors. A handful accepted temporary bodyguards, but most refused to be silenced. Their courage inspired the public and also marked them as targets. One famous investigative duo uncovered offshore accounts linked to multiple contract killings. Before they could publish the full series, their office suffered a mysterious fire. Officially, faulty wiring was blamed. Unofficially, few doubted that someone wanted their hard drives reduced to ash. Even television anchors, usually seen as safe, felt the chill. Popular talk shows that invited investigative journalists found their sponsors suddenly backing out. Broadcasters faced tax audits. In some cases, entire stations went off air overnight, citing technical issues that insiders knew were far from accidental. Yet the most disturbing pattern was how investigations collapsed. Files went missing. Evidence was lost in transit. Prosecutors transferred cases to distant districts where they quietly expired. A few determined detectives pushed forward anyway until sudden car crashes or abrupt resignations ended their efforts. Despite the danger, courageous reporters continued to publish. Their persistence gave the public rare glimpses of the hidden wars shaping the new economy. They described silent partnerships between business magnates and ex-security operatives, and they followed money trails across borders long before leaked documents became common. Their work revealed that contract killings were rarely isolated crimes. They often coincided with big financial moves, mergers, takeovers, or critical votes in Parliament. In other words, the bullets of the 90s often served boardroom or political goals. By the mid-decade, fear settled over newsrooms like a heavy curtain. Young journalists weighed every headline against personal safety. Editors debated whether one more exposé was worth another funeral. Some still went ahead, believing that light was stronger than darkness. Their bravery left behind key records that historians still study today. The attacks on the press did more than silence voices. They reshaped the information landscape. Without fearless journalism, powerful groups operated with greater freedom, setting the stage for the next, even more dangerous arena. Soon, contract killings would step directly into politics itself. And that is where we go next, into the deadly game of political power plays. Political power plays. A chill seemed to settle over city halls and parliament corridors as the 90s unfolded. Politicians still gave speeches and cut ribbons, but behind the smiles was a rising dread. Everyone knew that one wrong alliance, one careless quote, could turn into a fatal mistake. The early killings of bankers and journalists had sent warnings, yet when bullets began to choose political winners and losers, the entire system trembled. In capital after capital, mayors, reform-minded ministers, and even parliamentary leaders were suddenly vulnerable. Take the case of a popular regional governor who had built his reputation on cleaning up corrupt energy contracts. He had survived endless smear campaigns and threats. But one night, after a meeting with local business leaders, his convoy was ambushed. Police rushed to call it a random attack, yet every seasoned observer suspected a carefully timed strike. The governor had planned to announce a new audit the very next day, an audit that insiders claimed would expose secret deals worth hundreds of millions. Elsewhere, a young parliamentary deputy with a reputation for fearless speeches collapsed in a quiet parking garage. He had been preparing a proposal to limit offshore banking loopholes. The official report blamed an isolated violent act, but those who knew him well whispered that financial clans saw his legislation as an existential danger. Each high-profile death sent shockwaves through political circles. Meetings grew shorter. Some lawmakers refused evening engagements altogether. Campaign rallies turned into carefully guarded fortresses. Behind closed doors, discussions no longer focused only on budgets or reforms. They included questions like, who might be next? The methods varied. Sometimes it was a drive-by shooting on a dark road. Other times, a bomb hidden in a parked car or a poisoned cup of tea. Each case carried a signature of professional planning and precise timing. These were not impulsive acts of anger. They were operations designed to remove a name from a ballot or halt a reform at a critical vote. Even when suspects were caught, trials often raised more questions than answers. Confessions appeared too convenient, evidence went missing, and key witnesses suddenly changed their testimony. Lawyers spoke carefully, hinting that invisible players were pulling strings far beyond the courtroom walls. Ordinary citizens followed every twist through evening news bulletins. They heard about committees promising deeper investigations, then quietly shelving reports. Over time, public trust in official explanations eroded. People began to believe that unseen alliances of business and security forces decided which leaders could rise and which would fall. Some politicians chose exile over risk, relocating to foreign capitals and sending warnings back home. Others forged pacts with influential business clans, trading independence for protection. A few doubled down, determined to keep their reform agendas alive despite the dangers. But the cost of courage grew higher with each assassination. This climate of fear changed policy itself. Instead of bold debates, parliaments filled with cautious compromises. Major reforms slowed to a crawl, while private deals between insiders flourished in the shadows. In effect, the threat of sudden violence became an unspoken instrument of governance. Through it all, one powerful driver kept surfacing: the struggle over natural resources and big money industries. Control over oil pipelines, gas fields, and strategic factories often lay at the heart of political rivalries. Whoever ruled those assets could fund parties, sway elections, and shape the future far beyond national borders. As political bloodshed blurred into economic rivalry, the trail of violence led straight into the world of energy, a world where fortunes were vast and conflicts even deadlier. The next chapter plunges into that high-stakes arena of the 90s, the billion-dollar oil wars. The billion-dollar oil wars. It began as a whisper in trading floors and private clubs. Oil was no longer just fuel. It was leverage, the quickest way to reshape an entire nation's balance of power. In the 90s, while ordinary citizens stood in long lines for gasoline, a handful of insiders scrambled to control the black gold beneath their feet. Pipelines became front lines. Tankers were chess pieces, and every barrel of crude meant not only money, but influence votes, policy shifts, even control of whole regions. Where vast wealth and weak oversight met, violence often followed. Across newly independent states and still fragile democracies, oil companies sprang up almost overnight. Some were real businesses, others were shells, built only to win export rights and then disappear. Bidding wars erupted for key drilling fields and shipping routes. Official auctions took place in daylight, but the real deals were cut in smoky back rooms. Soon, the conflicts spilled into the open. Rival energy executives faced ambushes on their way to board meetings. An oil trader known for securing rare overseas contracts was found dead in his bulletproof car, which had been expertly tampered with. In another case, a promising young manager vanished on a routine trip to inspect a remote pumping station. His briefcase surfaced days later in a distant river, but not a trace of him. Investigators struggled to connect the dots. Each murder looked clean, almost surgical. Witnesses were scarce. Physical evidence evaporated. When questions reached too high, inquiries stalled in bureaucratic fog. Yet patterns emerged. Deaths often coincided with critical negotiations: a new export pipeline, a privatization tender, or a vote to allow foreign partnerships. Oil was also reshaping global politics. Western and Asian corporations competed fiercely for access to the Caspian Basin and Siberian reserves. Local businessmen struck alliances with foreign investors, while national governments tried to keep strategic control. At times, the competition became so tense that insiders described it as an undeclared war, one fought not with armies, but with bribes, sabotage, and contract killings. A striking example involved a massive pipeline project meant to bypass traditional routes. Billions of dollars depended on its success. Over the course of a single year, 3 executives tied to rival proposals died in suspicious circumstances. Official explanations ranged from accidents to health issues, but the timing convinced many observers that these were more than coincidences. Financial secrecy deepened the intrigue. Profits from new oil exports often disappeared into offshore accounts, hidden behind layers of shell companies. Leaked banking documents years later hinted at astonishing sums moving between anonymous entities, some connected to victims, others to suspected organizers of violence. But by then, key witnesses were long gone. Local communities paid a heavy price. In some oil-rich areas, strikes and environmental protests were met not just with police action, but with mysterious acts of intimidation. Village leaders who resisted land seizures sometimes faced late-night visits from masked strangers or suffered accidents on lonely roads. While not every tragedy was linked to oil, the atmosphere of fear was impossible to ignore. For ordinary citizens watching the evening news, it became clear that oil was more than an economic resource. It was a hidden scriptwriter of politics and violence. Each new contract might spark another crisis, and each assassination shifted billions of dollars in future profits. By the late 90s, even seasoned insiders admitted that no single government truly controlled the energy sector. Networks of private security firms, retired intelligence agents, and offshore financiers operated across borders, forming alliances and rivalries that no parliament could easily untangle. And in those shadows, another force stirred veterans of secret services who had found new roles as private operatives. Their skills, honed in covert missions, were now for sale to the highest bidder. As the oil wars raged on, these professionals began to shape the very nature of contract killings. To understand how the methods of espionage fused with organized crime, we move next into Shadows of the Secret Services. Shadows of the Secret Services. It started quietly, almost invisibly. A rumor here, a whispered name there. People spoke of men who never fully left the agencies they once served, operatives with training too rare to waste and contacts too valuable to abandon. In the turbulent 90s, when governments were weak and fortunes ripe for the taking, these shadows found a new market for their old skills. They were masters of surveillance and disguise. They could plan an ambush with the precision of a military operation and vanish without a trace. Some offered themselves as private security experts. Others built consulting firms that looked perfectly legal. But beneath the business cards was a different reality, the same strategic thinking that once protected states, now protected and sometimes eliminated clients. The pattern of many high-profile killings carried a familiar signature. There were no panicked gunmen or sloppy mistakes. Instead, victims were followed for days, their routines charted minute by minute. Street cameras conveniently failed at just the right moment. Escape routes were cleared. These were hallmarks of professional tradecraft, not random street crime. Stories emerged of ex-intelligence officers renting their services to whoever paid best. Oligarchs guarding energy empires, political factions seeking an edge, even foreign interests eager to influence young markets. Some specialists offered full packages, from information gathering to the final strike. Payment often flowed through offshore accounts, leaving almost no paper trail. A telling case involved a prominent industrialist who was negotiating a groundbreaking metals contract. Weeks before his sudden death, neighbors noticed unmarked vans parked near his house. Phone records later revealed silent calls, empty lines that served as location pings. On the night of the murder, power to his street went out for precisely 10 minutes. The killers were gone before electricity returned. Seasoned investigators remarked privately that only someone with advanced technical training could manage such flawless timing. Not all former agents acted for profit alone. Some remained quietly tied to fragments of their old organizations. During a period of tense regional conflicts, there were murmurs of unofficial missions meant to shape outcomes without open state involvement. In those gray zones, it became almost impossible to say where government interests ended and private contracts began. Occasionally, brave insiders spoke out. A retired officer hinted in a rare interview that certain operations of the decade were never logged because they were never meant to exist. Another suggested that the boundary between national security and personal enrichment had completely blurred. Their remarks quickly disappeared from major outlets, reinforcing public suspicion that some truths were still off-limits. Meanwhile, ordinary people felt the indirect impact. High-stakes kidnappings, vanishing witnesses, and unexplained sabotage became common enough to change daily habits. Families kept emergency cash hidden. Businesses hired multiple layers of protection, unsure whom they could really trust. The very idea of a safe public space seemed to shrink. By the late 90s, many experts believed that the old spy world had not dissolved at all. It had simply moved into new clothing private firms, consulting agencies, and security startups that blended seamlessly into the legal economy. From these cover identities, former operatives could shape financial deals, influence elections, or quietly remove obstacles. This Secret Service legacy added a new dimension to contract killings: international reach. Some operations stretched across borders, hinting at shared networks that connected seemingly separate crimes in different countries. Which leads naturally to the next question that haunted investigators and journalists alike. How far beyond national borders did these dark alliances extend? To answer that, we follow the trail outward, into the murky realm of the Western Connections. The Western Connections. By the late 1990s, investigators began noticing a curious pattern. Clues from violent cases in Moscow, Kiev, and the Caucasus kept pointing far beyond former Soviet borders. Names of shell companies popped up in London and New York. Weapons traced back to European black markets. Phone logs contained calls to numbers in Switzerland and Cyprus. The murders no longer looked like purely local affairs. Whispers spread in financial circles first. Traders spoke of mysterious clients who moved vast sums through offshore accounts overnight, buying influence in multiple countries at once. Some of these transfers coincided uncannily with high-profile killings. A reformer died in Eastern Europe. The very next week, a London-registered firm suddenly controlled a lucrative export license once tied to the victim. Law enforcement agencies in Western capitals were slow to react. Many of the companies involved were legally registered and paid taxes on paper. But beneath the official filings lay complicated ownership chains. Every time police tried to trace a suspect shareholder, the trail jumped to another jurisdiction, first Luxembourg, then the Caribbean, then a quiet corner of Delaware. Meanwhile, certain Western cities developed reputations as meeting grounds. Hotels in Vienna, Berlin, and Paris hosted discreet gatherings where negotiators discussed energy routes and giant privatization deals. Security cameras often recorded the arrivals, but rarely the departures. Witnesses spoke of envelopes changing hands and of ex-intelligence figures sitting side by side with international bankers. Some American and European organized crime groups also intersected with this new landscape. Drug cartels from South America, for example, needed reliable channels to launder profits. They found partners in newly privatized banks and shipping firms willing to move goods and money under the same protective fog that shielded post-Soviet fortunes. Contracts made in a seaside cafe in Spain could influence who lived or died thousands of kilometers away. Journalists who followed these trails discovered that many suspects traveled freely across borders. One contract killer sought in Eastern Europe vacationed openly on the French Riviera. Another, wanted for questioning about a pipeline dispute, appeared at charity galas in New York. Extradition requests got lost in paperwork or stalled in drawn-out legal debates about jurisdiction. The involvement of financial institutions added another twist. Some small banks in Western Europe experienced unexplained cash surges just days after violent incidents abroad. Later, Leaked documents suggested these deposits were routed through multiple shell accounts before ending up in respected investment funds. By the time authorities pieced the story together, key players had long vanished. These global links complicated every investigation. A single murder might require cooperation between half a dozen countries, each with different legal systems and political interests. Even when governments were willing, the sheer complexity made it easy for culprits to stay hidden. For ordinary people reading morning papers in London or Chicago, the violence of the 90s felt distant. Yet hidden in financial pages were subtle signs, sudden market moves, unexplained resignations of executives, brief notes about mysterious deaths abroad. The dots were there, but only a few experts tried to connect them. As the decade ended, one thing became clear to those experts. The killings of the 90s were not simply local gang wars. They were pieces of a larger puzzle, with money and influence flowing across oceans. Offshore havens, secret trusts, and coded transactions formed the arteries of this dark global body. And those secret money routes lead us naturally to the next layer of the story, where hidden finance itself becomes a weapon. To see how cash and crime merged in plain sight, we move on to money trails and offshore secrets. Money trails and offshore secrets. The 90s were an age of sudden wealth and sudden disappearances of that wealth. Fortunes made in a single week could vanish into thin air, leaving behind only a paper fog of shell companies and coded bank accounts. For contract killers and those who hired them, this new world of offshore finance was a perfect playground. It usually began with a routine transfer, a few $1 million wired from a commercial bank to a newly formed firm in Cyprus or to a boutique trust in Liechtenstein. From there, the money jumped again to the Caribbean, to the Channel Islands, to secret accounts in Asia. Each hop left a neat receipt, but no clear owner. By the time investigators caught wind of the movement, the trail had passed through so many jurisdictions that no single country could claim authority. These financial labyrinths were not accidental. International consultants taught clients how to hide assets behind layers of nominees and fictitious directors. Some companies existed for only a few days, just long enough to sign a contract or receive a suspiciously large consulting fee. Then they dissolved, leaving nothing but an empty mailbox and a hard-to-trace wire. Major killings of the decade often match this rhythm. Within days of a high-profile murder, offshore banks recorded spikes of mysterious deposits. In one famous case, a business rival of a slain shipping magnate suddenly gained control of key export routes. Bank leaks years later revealed a flurry of overnight transfers to his associates' payments disguised as equipment rentals and legal advice. Leaked emails from the era show how precisely these operations were planned. Lawyers in Geneva discussed code words to use in contracts. Accountants in London timed currency exchanges to confuse auditors. And always, there were small but vital details: which phone numbers to call, which couriers to trust, which passports to carry for sudden travel. Even ordinary citizens could sense something strange. Local newspapers occasionally reported on a neighborhood office filled with expensive computers that never seemed to open its doors. Employees came and went at odd hours. After a few months, the company disappeared, leaving no trace except a name on a mailbox and a stack of unpaid local bills. For crime syndicates and corrupt officials, these mechanisms were more than a way to park money. They were strategic tools. Hidden wealth could finance political campaigns, pay for mercenary teams, or buy silence from key witnesses. If an inconvenient investigator got too close, funds were ready for special arrangements, from bribes to professional intimidation. International regulators tried to respond. New anti-money laundering rules appeared in Western capitals, yet enforcement lagged far behind the inventiveness of the schemes. Offshore lawyers treated every new regulation as a puzzle to be solved. With each legal update, they produced a fresh workaround: new trusts, fresh proxy owners, different tax havens. Meanwhile, whistleblowers who dared to expose these secrets often faced grave risks. Bank clerks who spotted unusual transfers lost their jobs after sudden restructuring. Auditors who filed suspicious activity reports sometimes found their careers derailed. In extreme cases, key insiders suffered unexplained accidents, fueling the belief that offshore money could reach back across oceans to silence threats. All of this turned money itself into a weapon. Hidden cash flows didn't just follow crimes, they enabled them, financing operations that stretched from financial capitals to distant industrial towns. The paper trail might be invisible, but the real-world effects, collapsed companies, silenced voices, and unsolved murders were brutally clear. By the end of the decade, investigators understood that following the money was the surest way to understand the killings. But they also learned something darker. Every time they approached a breakthrough, someone key would vanish, retire abruptly, or meet an untimely end. Which leads us directly to the next chapter of this story. The men and women whose job was to find the truth, those who sometimes paid the highest price. The stage is set for the investigators who got too close. The investigators who got too close. They were supposed to be the guardians of justice, the detectives, prosecutors, and forensic experts whose task was to chase the truth wherever it led. But in the stormy 90s, even those guardians were not safe. Again and again, investigators who probed too deeply into contract killings found the ground vanish beneath their feet. Some sensed danger early. They noticed tailing cars on the way home or received cryptic late-night phone calls. A few discovered tiny surveillance devices hidden in their offices. Still, many pressed on. They believed their badges and the law would protect them. One celebrated homicide detective built his reputation cracking impossible cases. When a prominent banker was shot in broad daylight, he vowed to track down the killers. Weeks later, his car spun off a well-lit highway in perfect weather. Officially, it was an accident. Colleagues who examined the wreck privately suspected tampering with the steering column. The file was closed within days. Another prosecutor assembled a massive dossier on links between offshore finance and a cluster of murders. He told friends he was ready to make everything public. Then came a random burglary at his apartment. Laptops, flash drives, and case notes disappeared, while cash and jewelry were left untouched. Shortly afterward, he accepted a sudden transfer to a distant rural district. He never spoke of the case again. Forensic experts faced similar fates. In one high-profile inquiry, the lead crime scene analyst identified rare chemical residues pointing to a professional weapons supplier. Before she could testify, she suffered a mysterious illness that doctors never fully explained. Her notes were later reported as misfiled and critical evidence lost. Even when no harm came to individuals, investigations met invisible barriers. Judges postponed hearings without clear reasons. Key witnesses retracted statements or moved abroad overnight. Interpol notices for prime suspects were inexplicably delayed. To the public, it looked as though the very machinery of justice had been reprogrammed. Families of victims felt these gaps most painfully. They watched brave officials promise breakthroughs, only to grow silent under unseen pressure. Some families hired private detectives who often found themselves shadowed or quietly warned off. A few investigators continued in secret, working late at night and keeping files in undisclosed locations. But secrecy brought its own dangers, isolating them from colleagues and protection. Not every story ended in tragedy. A handful of persistent detectives survived to retire quietly, sometimes releasing memoirs years later. Their accounts reveal subtle tactics used against them: endless audits, sudden tax bills, anonymous tips meant to discredit, or carefully planted rumors of misconduct. Each tactic slowed progress without drawing public attention. What made these struggles especially striking was how closely they mirrored the crimes themselves. Just as contract killers moved through layers of intermediaries, the forces obstructing justice used layers of bureaucracy and plausible deniability. The result was the same: truth buried beneath paperwork and fear. Ordinary citizens watched in frustration as promising investigations dissolved. Over time, many concluded that the system simply could not or would not solve crimes that threatened powerful interests. Trust in institutions weakened, and a sense of resignation crept in. Some murders, people said, were never meant to be solved, yet the story did not end there. Despite danger and setbacks, fragments of evidence survived: documents hidden by families, confessions whispered on deathbeds, letters smuggled to journalists. These fragments kept the hope of eventual disclosure alive, and they remind us that the killings of the 90s were never just about single crimes. They were pieces of a larger picture still unfinished. To see that bigger picture, we must step back and look at the many unsolved cases and the legends that have grown around them. Our next chapter explores exactly that world of mystery and speculation in Unfinished Cases and Living Myths. Unfinished Cases and Living Myths. Years have passed since the frantic 90s, yet many of the decade's most shocking murders remain officially unsolved. Court files gather dust, while rumors and legends keep the memories alive. These open endings have turned individual tragedies into something larger: stories that refuse to die, feeding new questions with every retelling. For families of victims, the absence of closure is a wound that never heals. They still keep boxes of documents, faded photographs, and private notes, hoping that one day a hidden witness will come forward. Some relatives gather annually at the sites of the killings, lighting candles and quietly sharing fragments of fresh gossip and overheard remark. A sudden recollection, a rumor passed down, like a secret inheritance. Journalists and historians, too, continue to circle these mysteries. They revisit the crime scenes, interview retired detectives, and comb through neglected archives. Each time they uncover something small: a mismatched bullet report, a forgotten letter from a foreign embassy, an unexplained flight booking. None of these fragments solves the puzzle, but together they create a portrait of a decade when truth was deliberately fragmented. Certain cases have taken on a life of their own. Names of key victims become shorthand for unresolved power struggles. City taxi drivers swap theories with the detail of seasoned investigators. Amateur detectives launch websites, comparing old photos and speculating about secret alliances. Some even claim that hidden diaries or recordings will one day surface, exposing everything. Legends thrive because official narratives often feel incomplete. When an inquiry is suddenly closed or evidence disappears, people fill the gaps with imagination. Was a foreign agency involved? Did a rival billionaire pay for silence? Or were some murders part of a larger covert game between states? Each theory spawns new debates, sometimes as passionate as the original news stories. Occasionally, a sudden leak electrifies public attention. An old banker's forgotten safe deposit box is opened, revealing coded ledgers. A retired driver confesses on his deathbed to witnessing a crucial meeting. But such revelations rarely deliver the neat endings people crave. Instead, they tend to complicate the story, showing that more players were involved than anyone guessed, or that the motive was deeper than money alone. Meanwhile, cultural memory keeps the cases alive. Films, novels, and documentaries turn real tragedies into gripping narratives. Songwriters reference famous unsolved murders, using them as metaphors for betrayal or lost innocence. In this way, the crimes of the 90s become both historical events and shared myths, shaping how societies remember that turbulent era. Even law enforcement officials, speaking anonymously years later, admit that some files were never meant to be solved. They point to missing evidence, conflicting jurisdictions, and political shifts that froze progress. A few hint that powerful deals were struck behind closed-doors, deals that made truth too dangerous to reveal. Yet not all hope is lost. Advances in digital forensics, DNA analysis, and data mining occasionally breathe new life into old evidence. Some long-dormant cases have been quietly reopened, suggesting that technology might one day unlock what fear and secrecy once kept hidden. These unfinished cases remind us that the 90s were not just a period of violent events, but a time when reality itself could be manipulated, facts could be buried, timelines rewritten, and memories reshaped. What survives is a mix of documented history and living legend, a fog where certainty and speculation coexist. But even the most enduring myths eventually point back to something concrete: the recurring patterns, the overlapping names, the same financial footprints. To grasp what all these mysteries might finally mean, we must try to connect those scattered pieces to see what can be known and what is still kept deliberately in the dark. That search for connections leads us naturally to our final exploration, where we weigh all the fragments and face the lingering question of truth itself. Next comes what we know and what we're not supposed to. What we know and what we're not supposed to. Decades have slipped by since the frantic years of the 90s, but the echoes of that violent decade still refuse to fade. Old case files, yellow with age, continue to guard their secrets. Yet scattered through those files and through memories of witnesses, bankers, and former agents lie fragments that point to a larger pattern. Piece them together, and a shadowy outline emerges, one that many believe some institutions would rather keep hidden. Look first at the timing. Major assassinations almost always coincided with crucial economic or political turning points. The sale of an energy giant, the signing of a pipeline contract, the rise of a bold reformer. It is as if each killing removed an obstacle just when powerful players needed a clear path. This repeated rhythm is hard to dismiss as coincidence. Money trails confirm the suspicion. Offshore leaks, once dismissed as rumor, now show striking overlaps. The same clusters of companies and trustees reappear in case after case, like fingerprints left in financial smoke. Funds jump from one shell firm to another and finally land in respected investment houses. On paper, everything looks legal, yet the sequence forms a hidden river connecting distant crimes. The cast of characters also recurs. Certain names, business consultants, security contractors, lawyers, show up in multiple investigations across different countries. Some testified once, then quietly relocated. Others denied any connection, but kept appearing in leaked correspondence. Each overlap strengthens the idea that these were not random episodes, but movements within a long, deliberate game. Equally revealing are the silences. Records that should exist simply don't. Tapes from crucial surveillance cameras were accidentally erased. Phone logs for key nights show unexplained gaps. Detectives who once promised breakthroughs later claimed faulty memory or declined to speak. These absences are like blank spaces on a map, and sometimes the blanks tell as much as the recorded facts. Insiders occasionally confirm the darker view. Retired intelligence officers, speaking off the record, admit that certain operations of the period were never logged because they were never meant to be. Former corporate strategists hint that business deals and covert missions were often two faces of the same coin. Their careful words suggest that some murders were not isolated crimes, but pieces of quiet geopolitical maneuvers. Ordinary citizens feel the weight of these patterns even if they lack the paperwork. They see how certain fortunes grew suddenly right after someone's death, how key laws stalled at the very moment their strongest supporters were silenced, how evidence of international involvement flickers in and out of view. The public sense that someone higher up knows more than they admit has become part of collective memory. And still, documents remain classified. Some files are sealed by national security rules for 50 years or more. Others are technically open, but so heavily redacted they are nearly blank. Requests for declassification bounce between agencies like a ball no one wants to catch. These bureaucratic walls may hide not only sensitive methods, but uncomfortable truths about alliances that once blurred the line between state and private power. Technology, however, is slowly eroding secrecy. Digital forensics, big data analysis, and future leaks may yet reveal patterns invisible to investigators of the past. Already, independent researchers using public datasets have linked offshore transactions to previously unknown associates of key victims. Each discovery feeds hope that the larger story will one day come into sharper focus. So what do we truly know? That money and violence moved together. That professional skill, often of people trained in intelligence work, shaped many killings. That political and economic turning points often dictated the moment of each attack. And that, despite decades of inquiry, a full accounting is still missing. What we are not supposed to know may be even larger. The hidden deals between states and private empires. The covert strategies masked as ordinary crime. The decisions made in smoky, late-night meetings that redirected entire countries. Until those secrets are finally exposed, the violent 90s remain an unfinished chapter-part history, part living mystery. And with that, our journey through the labyrinth of contract killings of the 1990s, hidden versions they never told us, comes full circle. The names, places, and fortunes may fade, but the unanswered questions keep their power, challenging every generation to look closer and ask what truths still lie locked behind closed doors.